They said the house at the edge of the village stood hollow, yet its windows glowed at night as if the timbers had learned to hold light even after the candles died. The villagers avoided the lane that led to it, though no decree forbade them. Fear grew not from rumor alone, but from absence, because families who had once walked into its doors were never seen again. Mothers vanished with infants still swaddled. Fathers went in seeking remedies for coughs or fevers, and their voices cut off mid-cry, leaving only silence that spread like a stain. Neighbors whispered of a physician who promised cures that priests could not bless and herbs could not offer. A man whose touch was soft and whose eyes seemed kind, but his patience did not return. Over time, the walls began to sweat with something thicker than dampness, dark trails that streaked downward like tears. They said the house wept for the lives it was swallowing. The villagers could not name what pulled them toward him. He spoke of progress and science, of remedies that could banish suffering, and yet his house carried the weight of mourning before the grave. Those who approached it noticed how sound seemed to thin near its walls, as if voices were taken from their throats and pressed into the brick. Windows gleamed with a glow no candle could explain, and at times faint shapes were seen passing across them, too slow, too deliberate, as though the house itself were pacing within. The structure was not grand, but it loomed larger than its measure, and those who stepped near felt their chest tighten as if the air itself recoiled. Parents clutched their children closer when they walked past, muttering that better a fever in the night than a cure offered inside those walls. Still, there were always those who believed. A child too weak to breathe, a laborer whose bones ached from years of toil, a woman whose belly swelled with something that would not pass. Each was carried across the threshold in desperation. The door closed quietly, and neighbors listened for signs of healing, for the sound of footsteps leaving in relief. Instead came muffled cries, sharp at first, then smothered, followed by an unnatural stillness. Some swore they heard a sound like chanting carried through the chimney, though no priest ever stepped inside. By dawn, the glow in the windows would fade, but the family would not return, and the house would once more appear abandoned, its silence deeper than before. It was not only sickness that drew victims in. There were whispers of invitations, handwritten notes pressed beneath doors, sealed with a wax mark none recognized. These promised relief, forgiveness, sometimes even wealth for those willing to partake in the physician's trials. The desperate and the curious alike followed, clutching the paper as though it were divine instruction. None returned. Those who dared speak of it said the notes carried a compulsion stronger than faith, a pressure on the mind that told the poor their hunger would end, and the grieving their loss could be reversed. Even when families tried to resist, there was always one among them who faltered, who slipped out in the night and was swallowed by the house. The survivors outside learned to explain away the disappearances. They told themselves these families had fled debt or shame, or been called to serve elsewhere. It was easier to believe in flight than in a house that consumed. Yet the ground around it betrayed the truth. Grass browned and refused to rise. Soil sagged as though something beneath was pulling it down, and the air reeked faintly of metal, as if blood had been poured into the earth. Children dared each other to press a hand to the walls, and those who did ran back screaming, saying the wood pulsed like flesh and left their palms wet with something slick. The elders silenced them quickly, afraid of what questions might invite. Inside, the physician worked unseen. He wore the mask of normalcy, appearing in town with clean hands and composed smile, but behind his walls he perfected methods that stretched life into prolonged silence. He wanted to know not just how bodies failed, but how they could be bent to his will before death came. Each disappearance became another entry in his private record, another experiment in patience, another test of endurance measured not in minutes, but in days of screaming that dwindled to whimpers and finally to prayer. He believed that suffering could be refined into knowledge, that agony was the truest teacher, and that only by hollowing a person completely could the mind be opened. The villagers did not yet know the scale of his cruelty, only the shape of its shadow. But already they felt it pressing into their lives. The market emptied earlier each week, neighbors shut doors against the dusk, and church bells rang longer than they once had, their echoes straining to cover the silence that followed another family's disappearance. At night, when the glow rose again behind the windows, the entire village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the screams to stop, knowing they always would. The house that would not empty grew fuller each day, yet it stood as hollow as ever, because what was taken inside did not return in any form that could be named alive. And still he smiled at funerals, his black coat blending with the mourners, his words soft with practiced sympathy. No one dared accuse him aloud, for who would confront the only physician they had left? Better to grieve in silence, to pretend the house was only a house, to tell children it was abandoned, though its windows burned each night with a light no hand lit. In this way, the silence of the villagers became as much a part of his method as the instruments hidden within his walls. They would not yet name his evil, but they had already become complicit in it. The house waited, glowing faintly, its walls damp and trembling as though it breathed. And the doctor within prepared for the next arrival, certain that desperation would soon lead another family to his door. Dr. Adrian Mallory had the hands of a saint and the eyes of a man who'd already buried you. He arrived in the region during a season of famine when disease ran faster than bread and faith alone could not keep the body from breaking. The village elders welcomed him like salvation, a learned man in a polished coat who quoted Galen and Christ in the same breath. He neither bowed too low nor stood too proud. At the pulpit he offered sermons of wellness. At the bedside he laid his fingers across foreheads slick with fever and whispered that healing would come. And sometimes it did. Children roused, bleeding slowed. The dying blinked, sat up and wept. It was enough to make people believe, but Mallory had never come to save. He had come to learn how people fell apart. He spoke often of the nervous system, of invisible messengers running through the body like spies reporting to a king. He said fear made the nerves hum louder, that suffering itself was a language if one only learned to listen. His fascination was not with curing disease, but with seeing how long the body could endure when hope was peeled away, layer by layer. He recorded how the breath changed after confession, how skin tensed under threats spoken in foreign tongues, how the will to live ebbed once a man realized his wife had died in the room beside him. He never used poison. That was too quick, too obvious. He preferred manipulation, rituals of comfort offered in stages, slowly twisted until the patient did not realize they had entered an experiment instead of a sanctuary. He was invited to dine with barons and bishops, praised for his civility and discretion. The clergy appreciated his restraint in blaming disease on sin. The nobility saw him as a solution to inconvenient inheritances and difficult servants. He returned each bow, each wineglass raised in his name, and took note of which noble's cousin had gone mad, which baron's daughter was too rebellious, which priest had confessed to impure thoughts and might not be missed. They sent him referrals in coded letters, requests for treatment in hushed tones, sealed with rings that left wax smudges of privilege. Mallory always accepted. He never charged. He said science was its own reward. What he never said was that each case became part of a structure he was building, not of wood, but of knowledge, and each victim was a beam, a joint, a weight-bearing wall. He didn't believe in murder. That was what simple men did in alleys with knives and curses. Mallory believed in observation. He could open a man without spilling blood, could take a child's voice with a look, could remove the will to live with nothing more than silence. He understood how ritual fed obedience, how chanting could make men forget their limbs, how being bathed in lavender before each torture made the victims associate pain with cleanliness. He found that the human mind endured longer when convinced it deserved the suffering, and so he whispered lies in comforting tones. This will heal you, this is penance, this is proof of God's favor. And they believed because Mallory never shouted. He never struck. He only offered, and they stepped forward. The worst were the children, not because of what he did, but because of what he could make them do. He trained them to turn on each other, convinced them that to survive meant to help him. He taught them to place the bindings around others' wrists, to steady the tray that held the glass tubes, to whisper prayers into ears that bled. Some lasted weeks, others only a night, but all were recorded. He wrote meticulously, not in numbers but in sensations. Subject 3 whimpered during bone retraction but ceased once told it would bring mother back. Notable endurance after the 5th incision. When a subject died, he didn't mourn. He didn't even pause. He simply turned to the next, marking the change in pitch, temperature, resistance. The deaths weren't failures. They were steps. In the village, his legend grew. The more that disappeared, the more people praised his discretion. He never spoke ill of the dead. He never returned belongings, never explained where the bodies went. But at every funeral he appeared, hat in hand, head bowed, eyes damp. He placed a single violet on each coffin and murmured a blessing no one quite recognized. Mothers thanked him for trying. Widowers shook his hand. The priest once called him an angel of mercy. Mallory only smiled, and beneath that smile lay the purest form of deception, a belief that what he did was not evil but necessary, that he was revealing something truer than life, something clean. The house at the edge of the village became his archive, its walls soaked in memory. Its floors echoed not with footsteps but with retching, with the scrape of nails against boards, with the click of metal too thin for forgiveness. Mallory never locked his doors. He didn't need to. Desperation always knocked, and he was always waiting. He was not just a man. He was a system, a mirror held up to power, showing what happened when people handed over suffering in exchange for silence. And as the funerals increased, so did his calm. No one asked why the violets never wilted, why he never aged, why those who vanished never had names written on the village memorial. He had found a way to make death quiet, and in doing so, made the living complicit. And still the windows glowed. Each time Mallory began a new trial, he started with the bones. Not the bones of his latest subject, but the bones of the last. Cleansed, scraped, measured, and catalogued until they no longer looked human but useful. He worked silently, as if following a ritual no one had written down. Ribs were always first. They curved just enough to shape the next, the way a lattice supports roses or a confessional muffles shame. He boiled them in lime water and ground lavender into the pot to sweeten the scent. The villagers who passed by said they could smell wildflowers from his windows, never knowing it was the perfume of death cooked clean. The cages he built were not metaphorical. They were real, intricately bound frames of rib and spine, reshaped to clamp around a torso and tighten with each inhale. The lungs could expand, but only so far. Then came the crack, then the prayer, then the silence. He called it the hymn of humility. It began with breathing, soft, cautious. The body fought to pull in air, but the cage resisted. One couldn't scream in a cage like that. Screaming required a full breath, and Mallory never allowed it. The ribs of the dead formed a chorus around the living, pressing the punishment of survival into the bones of the next victim. If they struggled, the cage tightened. If they collapsed, it loosened just enough to revive panic. Mallory never forced anyone to wear them. He simply explained the choice: die free or live long enough to understand your limits. They always chose life, not realizing that the cage would redefine what life meant. He placed mirrors in front of them, always, so they could watch themselves suffocate. He believed that seeing one's body fail was part of the process. It wasn't enough for the bones to crack. The mind had to break too. He wanted them to witness how their chests swelled and stopped, how their skin grayed, how their eyes watered, not just from pain but from shame. They begged in whispers, never aloud, because breath was currency. Some turned to prayer, others wept. A few tried to sing, creating melodies from shallow gasps, and he recorded these carefully, noting pitch, duration, and emotional content. Subject 9, attempted lullaby at hour 19, he wrote. Pattern consistent with childhood regression. High value. No one survived the hymn of humility. Not really. A few were released, staggering and half-conscious, their torsos bruised and sunken. Their ribs bore fractures in precise intervals, measured gaps where bone met bone in unnatural embrace. They spoke little, slept less. Most ended their own lives within days. Mallory made no effort to stop them. In fact, he encouraged it. Suicide, he believed, was a form of data, proof that humility had been reached. He kept their bones, of course, noting which ribs had cracked last, which had held firm. These became the foundation for the next cage, passed down like scripture, each generation bound by the remnants of the one before. Children were the most resilient. Their ribs were soft, pliable, willing to bend before breaking. Mallory favored them for endurance trials. He once built a cage entirely of children's ribs, fragile, white, laced with silk and coated in resin. He called it the Cradle of Mercy. It shattered after 4 days, leaving the subject in pieces. Mallory wept when it failed, not for the child but for the design. He wanted elegance in his suffering. a purity. Death was not the goal. Revelation was. If the body broke too soon, the mind couldn't reach it. He needed them to last, to suffer long enough that the structure of their identity collapsed. In that collapse, he believed, was truth. The church knew, not all of it, but enough. A visiting bishop once inspected his records under the guise of confession. Mallory showed him the cages, polished, labeled, stacked like instruments. The bishop asked no questions. Instead, he requested the removal of a local heretic. Mallory obliged. Days later, the man was found hanging in his cell, his torso caved inward, the pattern of pressure unmistakable. The guards called it suicide. The bishop called it penance. Mallory recorded it as induced collapse, subject B3. The church never returned, but it never interfered again. The villagers, meanwhile, continued to disappear. Those who heard faint cracking from beneath his floorboards told themselves it was old wood. Those who saw glimpses of bone through open windows said it was animal work. Perhaps some strange taxidermy. Denial had become a reflex. Mallory understood this and used it. He kept the cages displayed, draped in lace and positioned like furniture. Guests who entered for treatment sat beside them, unaware of what framed the chairs. He served tea in cups held by skeletal fingers, and no one ever asked why. Their eyes saw, but their minds refused. He called this ambient conditioning. He believed silence could be trained like a dog, and he trained it well. One winter, a family of 4 entered his house and never emerged. Weeks later, Mallory displayed a new cage in his study, tall, elegant, 4 sets of ribs interwoven like vines, each curve spiraling around a central pillar of vertebrae. He invited a visiting scholar to observe it, claiming it was an anatomical teaching model. The scholar marveled at the craftsmanship. He never asked whose bones they were. Mallory offered him wine, recorded his reaction, and added his name to the ledger. He would return soon, the doctor said when he needed more clarity. By spring, the house groaned with memory. The cages no longer sat still. They creaked, shifted, whispered in the dark. Some said the dead pressed their breath through the cracks, trying to complete the hymn. But Mallory knew better. The dead didn't speak. They listened. They watched. They waited. Each cage held more than bone. It held guilt, failure, proof that mercy was a myth. And still he built more, not because he needed them, but because the silence they created was the only sound he trusted. And outside, the village slept. The windows of his house glowed faintly through the fog, and inside the doctor began preparing another cage. This one would be different, he said. This one would hold a subject longer than any before. He selected the ribs with care, humming softly. A hymn. They called it the Quiet Orchard, rows of trees that never failed to bloom, even in the harshest winters. The blossoms were white, like small shrouds strung from every branch, and the fruit they bore was unnaturally red, almost bruised in hue, with flesh that bled when torn by teeth. People said the apples grew sweeter each year, as though ripened by some divine secret in the soil. No one asked why the roots had grown so thick, why the ground beneath them had gone soft, or why children who picked the fruit sometimes cried afterward without knowing why. They only knew the orchard fed them when other crops failed. At the heart of that orchard stood the chapel. Its bell no longer rang. Its windows had been dark for years. Yet people still knelt at its threshold, whispering prayers they no longer believed. The font inside had once held holy water, enough to bless a village. Now it held something else. Mallory had sealed the well beneath it, lined it with iron and stone, and turned it into a furnace. He said it was to cleanse sickness, said it was the most merciful way to release the afflicted. But no one asked why the font's rim was blackened or why the stone around it bore nail scratches too small to be from any adult. Mallory began with the sickest children, those already dying, those whose bodies trembled with fever or lungs bubbled with fluid. He told the parents there was no cure, only peace. He offered comfort, then closed the doors. What happened inside the chapel was never seen, but the smell reached far beyond the steeple. It was sweet and sharp, like burning sugar and bone. Some villagers wept as they walked past, unable to name what they felt. Others turned their heads and swallowed their guilt like the apples their children still clutched in small hands. The ashes were never buried. Mallory did not believe in coffins or crosses. He said the body was a seed, not a relic, and so he scattered what remained beneath the apple trees. Each tree bore the weight of a name unspoken, each root tangled with the dust of innocence. He worked at dawn, long before the market stalls opened, pressing the ashes deep into the earth with his bare hands. He hummed as he worked, quiet, reverent, like a man tending graves he called gardens. He wore white while he did it, as if daring God to object. And then the trees began to change. Their bark darkened, their fruit thickened. The orchard became impossible to ignore. Women swore the apples eased childbirth. Men said the juice healed their joints. Children laughed louder after eating them, only to fall ill days later with dreams they couldn't wake from. Some said they saw faces in the leaves, small and pale, with mouths open in mid-cry. Others said the trees whispered when the wind moved through them, calling out names no one wanted to remember. Mallory kept a record of each tree, whose ash fed which root, how the fruit tasted in each season, which trees bore twins and which bore none. He experimented with mixing ashes, siblings buried under the same roots, strangers combined to see if the bitterness changed. He charted their growth like a physician tracking a heartbeat. He spoke of returning the body to the earth in its purest form, of breaking the cycle of rot and waste. But beneath that language was something darker. He didn't just want to feed the trees, he wanted to prove that suffering could nourish beauty, that agony could be harvested. He brought families to the orchard for picnics, said the air was cleaner there. He watched mothers slice fruit for their children, fathers chew slowly and remark on the flavor. He studied their faces as they swallowed, the twitch of muscle, the pause between bites, the way their eyes glazed with something too deep to name. He never told them whose bones fed the trees. He never had to. The truth clung to the bark like old blood. Some villagers began to avoid the orchard, but others came more often. The apples became currency. Women traded them for fabric, men for medicine. Mallory began pressing them into cider, clear and cold and slightly pink, and he offered it at wakes and weddings alike. He said it honored the dead to drink what they had given. No one objected, not aloud. One day a child named Elsie wandered into the orchard alone. She picked a fruit, bit into it, and screamed before collapsing. When her mother found her, the girl's lips were stained deep red, and her hands trembled with cold. She couldn't speak for days. When she did, she asked if the apple had screamed before she did. Mallory examined her quietly, touched her forehead and declared it a seizure. The villagers accepted this, they always did. The orchard continued to grow. Some trees split into unnatural shapes, their trunks twisted like writhing limbs. One bore fruit with hollow cores, small teeth embedded inside the flesh. Mallory saved those for himself. He said they were the most precious, proof that the transformation was still incomplete, that the body could still push through the soil and shape the world. He often stood at the edge of the orchard at dusk, watching the sun pass through branches heavy with death made sweet. The sky behind him turned the color of dried blood. He stood still, serene, hands folded behind his back. He watched the villagers chew. He listened to them thank him, and he smiled, not because they were grateful, but because they would never ask where the sweetness came from. And as night fell, the trees rustled with more than wind. Beneath the soil, roots curled tighter, and the ash began to shift. The cellar was never spoken of, even among those who served Dr. Mallory in silence. The staircase that led down to it was narrow and cold, carved not for visitors but for secrets. There were no candles along the descent, only a dim red glow from below, like a wound that refused to close. The walls sweated even in winter, and the smell that rose from beneath the house was neither rot nor mold, but something sweet and sour, like fruit left too long in the sun, like iron steeped in honey. Those who entered rarely returned, and those who did would not meet your eyes. They made sounds with their throats, but not their mouths, sounds that stopped short of speech. That was Mallory's design. His greatest fear, he once wrote, was not being stopped, it was being remembered. And so he made memory impossible. His victims were not merely silenced, they were erased from the fabric of language. Each one taken into his care was eventually faced with the same moment. A gentle hand on the cheek, a quiet nod, and a choice that was not a choice. Some begged for mercy, others bit down on their tongues, hoping to destroy them first. But Mallory was always faster. His blades were thin as needles, curved like smiles. He severed at the base, cauterizing with a wire soaked in spirits, the hiss of burning flesh muffled by the patient's own trembling body. Once taken, the tongues were not discarded. They were washed in brine, dried slowly over coals, and carved with the patient's name, first and last. Mallory used bone needles, threading sinew through the base of each one, linking them side by side into long dangling strands. These were then stitched into great hanging sheets, macabre tapestries that covered the walls of his cellar. Each tongue curved slightly in death, as if still trying to form words. The names etched into them formed patterns, sometimes repeated, sometimes reversed, depending on how the tongues had curled as they died. Mallory said it was like a hymnal, each stitch a note, each victim a verse in the song of silence. He arranged them carefully. Children's tongues were hung lowest, where their silence might weigh most heavily on the viewer. The tongues of clergy were set in the center, surrounded by the tongues of the sick, the poor, the rebellious. Those of women who had questioned him bore deeper carvings, as if the blade had not only cut but punished. He called it the choir of the damned. He believed that if speech could be removed, memory would follow. If no one could name what was done to them, then the truth would rot inside them, forgotten even to themselves. Survivors were returned to the village occasionally, pale, shaking, their mouths forever open but empty. They tried to write, but their hands had been broken or trembled too violently. Some scratched at walls, drew symbols, but their attempts were dismissed as madness. The villagers looked away, told each other the poor souls had gone simple, that illness had stolen their minds. They did not connect them to the chapel, to the orchard, to the house whose cellar breathed. The silence made it easier. Mallory made sure of that. Some survivors suffocated days later. Infection took them slowly, stitches festering, tongues, stumps swelling, blocking their airways. Others starved. They could not ask for food. They could not scream. They simply curled inward until they died of something less visible than pain. Isolation. Mallory kept those bodies for a time, studying the curve of the spine in despair, noting how quickly the eyes dimmed once the voice was removed. He found that grief shortened the breath, that hopelessness changed posture. He wrote that silence had measurable weight, and that each patient carried it like a stone in their chest. The cellar grew colder as the tapestries thickened. The air moved differently, like breath passing between the strands. At night, Mallory claimed he could hear a faint murmur from the walls, a vibration in the silence like words trying to return. He welcomed it. He believed the tongues were not truly dead, that they remembered what they could not say, that they mourned their own erasure and wanted only to be heard again. But no one ever listened. The villagers saw the survivors and called them cursed. They avoided them, then forgot them. One woman, Sister Eloise, a former midwife, tried to gather them, tried to house them, feed them, understand their gestures. But she too disappeared, and her house burned days later. They found no remains. Only a single burnt tongue nailed to her door, the name carved into it warped by heat. Mallory said it must have been vandals. The villagers nodded. It was easier to believe in vandals than to ask who had carved the name. Mallory's cellar was not a chamber of madness. It was a library, a record, a vault of silences so dense they seemed to echo. He would sit for hours beneath the hanging tongues listening, not for sound but for stillness, for the pressure that came when something long buried pressed against the air. He believed the silence in that room was sacred, that it made him holy, that each victim in losing their tongue had become something purer, no longer bound by words, by complaint, by the burden of story. He believed he had freed them. And above, the house stood still. The walls did not groan. The doors remained unlocked. The villagers walked past, their eyes forward. The orchard grew sweeter. The chapel remained cold. And beneath it all, the choir waited. Not to speak again, but to make the world quiet enough to remember what they had lost. In the salons of Versailles, where perfume masked the stench of rot and powdered wigs sat atop heads full of quiet panic, Dr. Adrian Mallory's name passed from mouth to mouth like a rare elixir spoken in careful admiration behind closed doors, always followed by a pause. They called him the gentleman of affliction, the physician of limits, the scalpel who left no scar. Among courtiers, his methods were not crimes but curiosities, clinical, philosophical, distant. When word reached the royal court that Mallory had succeeded in prolonging suffering past the point of conscious resistance, they didn't recoil. They wrote letters. King Louis XV never summoned Mallory directly. It would have been uncouth to acknowledge such a man formally. Instead, intermediaries reached out, nobles whose households were plagued with trouble. a daughter with fits that embarrassed the family name, a nephew whose politics leaned too far toward the streets, a bastard heir too close to legitimate bloodlines. They needed resolution without spectacle. Mallory offered just that. Discretion was his art. He didn't kill them. He sanctified them. He transformed them into lessons. When a marquis sent his ward for treatment, Mallory returned only a lock of hair, a polished tooth, and a certificate claiming completion. The family wept with relief. They threw a ball that evening. Debtors and peasants arrived in wagons under cover of night, heads bowed, wrists bound loosely so they could still sign consent. Many believed they were being given a chance, offered a cure in exchange for cooperation. They were told they would serve a higher purpose. Mallory called them subjects of resilience. He explained to the nobles that pain revealed character, that suffering cleansed rebellion, that silence could be taught if one only reached deep enough. For each request, he sent back something symbolic, a finger carved into a chess piece, a mask made from stitched eyelids, a rosary assembled from polished knuckle bones. They were tokens of absolution, proof that the problem had been handled. The crown never stopped him. Why would it? He served a need too delicate to speak aloud. In an age of appearances, Mallory made shame disappear. He framed his work in the language of reform, experiments in restraint, endurance, obedience. He said the body was a bell that rang truest when near collapse. He documented pulse rates during starvation, how long the bowels held when dignity was removed, how the voice changed under religious suggestion. He created rituals around it. Some victims were bathed in wine before dissection. Others were read royal decrees while flayed, as if the law itself could soften the blade. He said this reminded them who ruled their flesh, and still he was paid. Quietly, in parcels of coin and land, in gifts of relics and rare herbs. One duchess sent him her confessor, claiming he had grown too curious about her son's inheritance. Mallory received him with warmth. When the body was returned, it had no tongue, no eyes, and no fingers, but the skin was flawless, unmarred, as though peace had been reached without resistance. The Duchess wrote a poem in his honor. It was never published, but every noble in her circle memorized it. There were whispers, of course. A few members of court found his trophies unsettling. A bishop's wife fainted when she saw a necklace made of vertebrae worn by a countess. But discomfort was not condemnation. In the court of Louis XV, cruelty became fashionable if cloaked in art. Mallory's methods were admired the way one admires a storm from behind glass. Awful, yes, but beautiful in its distance. He hosted private exhibitions for select audiences. Behind velvet curtains, they viewed proofs of his theories. A servant girl who could remain awake through 40 hours of pain without screaming. A former soldier who had been taught to confess to crimes he'd never committed, simply through the application of pressure and calculated rhythms. Nobles clapped. Some cried. One prince vomited, then begged to return. Mallory began designing rituals for the court itself. He proposed that each act of judgment be followed by a ceremonial silence to honor the weight of decisions. He suggested trials where the guilty be dressed in the garments of saints so that punishment might feel redemptive. His ideas spread without his name. No one wanted to admit they came from a cellar-bound doctor in a cursed village. But soon, silence became sacred. Public executions grew less frequent. Hidden rooms grew more common. The church did not object, not loudly. Mallory framed his work as moral instruction. He claimed that by mapping the boundaries of human endurance, he was defining the soul's reach. He told a visiting abbot that he'd seen men meet God with their jaws broken and eyes sewn shut. The abbot nodded. A month later, he sent his wayward brother for treatment. Mallory never stepped foot in Versailles. He didn't need to. Versailles came to him in carriages cloaked at night, in letters written in code, in packages of silken hair and fine shoes with no owner. The elite didn't fear Mallory. They feared being without him. In a world ruled by appearances, he was the keeper of secrets, the eraser of embarrassments. His house was not a prison, it was a service. And as long as the fruit kept growing in the orchard, as long as the chapel stayed quiet, as long as the tapestries hung undisturbed in the cellar, the crown would keep looking away. Mallory had become more than a man. He was a mechanism of power, a dark thread woven through the seams of monarchy. His hands were the ones that wiped clean what the court would not see. And in the silence he created, the kingdom slept easier. Even now, records from Louis XV's court remain sealed. The names are redacted, the locations buried. But the ledger Mallory kept, handwritten, bound in skin, remains hidden in the ruins of the orchard. Its pages do not rot. Each line bears a crest, each line bears a death, and beneath each death, a single word, requested. At first, the changes were subtle, barely noticed by the villagers who had long learned to avert their eyes. A warmth beneath the floorboards, a pulse in the air that couldn't be blamed on weather. The house at the edge of the village had always seemed to shimmer faintly with dread, but now it began to move. Not outwardly, not with creaks or moans that could be dismissed as the settling of wood, but with something deeper. A rhythm, a breath. It was said that the walls rose and fell slightly if one pressed a hand to them long enough. The plaster never cooled. The beams seemed to pulse, and when the wind struck the eaves, it no longer howled. It whispered, as if the wind had found a mouth in the rafters. Mallory had decided that the mind was not enough. Thoughts could lie, blood could be masked, but breath revealed everything. He believed respiration was the truest confession, that the lungs were the only organ incapable of deceit. And so he sought to turn breath into permanence. He carved chambers within the walls, spaces lined with thin copper piping that connected one victim to another, lungs stitched open, bellows driven by the slow collapse of the rib cage. Each new patient brought into the house was not given a room, they were given a function. Some were fitted beneath the stairwell, others beneath the floor, their mouths sealed but their nostrils open. Mallory adjusted their posture, bound their ribs in angles designed to keep air flowing. He called it the Unified Respiration Project, but to those who survived long enough to realize what was happening, it had no name, only suffering. Victims were drugged with vapors that dulled movement but preserved awareness. They felt every inhalation taken from them. Each exhale fed into another, like a grotesque circulatory system powered by desperation. Some lasted days, others weeks. Mallory walked the house daily, listening to the flow of air through the pipes, marking pressure with small ivory dials embedded in the floor. When one section grew quiet, he replaced the lungs. He kept backups in jars, preserved and labeled. They hung on the walls like tools. Eventually, the villagers began to notice, not because of what they saw, but because of what they heard. The house had begun to sigh. At dusk, when the light dimmed just so, A long exhale could be heard from beneath the shutters, like a beast tired of pretending to sleep. Sometimes the sigh carried a voice, barely formed, half-choked, the breath of someone trying to speak through water. Those who lived closest claimed the walls whispered their names and that the whispers grew louder when someone nearby grew ill. Some fled, most stayed. It was easier to believe it was the wind. The warmth became harder to ignore. Even in the coldest months, frost never formed on the house's windows. The snow melted before it touched the shingles. Mallory said nothing. When asked, he smiled and said insulation was important for healing. But inside, the house had become something else. The walls were no longer hollow, they were alveoli, each plank a rib, each pipe a vein. When Mallory walked the halls, he did not feel alone. The floorboards rose slightly with each step as if greeting him. He recorded this, called it responsive architecture. He said the structure had developed presence, not consciousness but obedience. There was one chamber at the heart of the house, hidden beneath the library floor behind a panel of etched bone. It held the original lungs. The first set. He had taken them from a girl who had been born without the ability to speak, but whose breathing had been unnaturally rhythmic, as though her body had memorized a song she could never sing. He kept her chest intact, her ribs held open with gold hooks, her lungs inflated with a bellows that rose and fell with the house's pulse. He believed she had become the conductor, the rhythm maker. He called her the keeper. Visitors were rare now, but those who stepped inside described a pressure in the chest as though their lungs had to match the rhythm around them or fail entirely. One man collapsed at the threshold, gasping. Mallory dissected him immediately, noting how his diaphragm had begun to flutter on its own. He wrote, "Subject failed to synchronize. Suggests architectural willpower exceeds organic adaptability." He was delighted. It meant the house had begun to reject what didn't serve it. Eventually, he stopped locking the doors. The house did that on its own. Mallory claimed he could now enter any room without touching a handle. That the air pressure shifted for him. Opened passages, closed them behind him. He whispered to the walls and believed they answered. He slept on a slab in the center of the house beneath a skylight that never fogged. Wrapped in the warm breath of those trapped around him, he said it was the safest place on earth. That death could not enter where breath did not cease. The villagers began to murmur again, not with anger, with awe. They spoke of the doctor who had tamed sickness, whose house never aged, whose windows always glowed. They did not know what pulsed beneath the floor. They only knew that those who went in came out less, and yet something always came back, warmth, breath, the strange illusion of life continuing. Mallory had made his home into a reliquary of breath, a shrine to the function of lungs divorced from speech. And still, the pipes hummed, the air moved, the house sighed. Beneath the boards, new lungs were being prepared, stitched and rinsed, waiting for their turn to serve. Mallory leaned close, listened to the heartbeat of the walls, and smiled. The house was alive. Not in the way that people feared, but in the way he had always dreamed. And outside, the trees of the orchard swayed, as if they too had learned to breathe. It began not with a scream, but with a silence too heavy to bear. A mother dropped a basket of apples, watching her son sway in the orchard, his mouth open but his eyes unfocused, humming the same broken rhythm he'd murmured since returning from the doctor's house. The village priest stopped his sermon mid-word when the wind carried something more than leaves past the chapel doors, a sound like a lung exhaling beneath the earth. And then came the child, skin pale, ribs visible through a torn shift, throat stitched with the precision of a surgeon. She did not cry. She only held out a folded note in shaking fingers. It read, "Do not remove the silence. It is what holds you together." That night the villagers gathered at the edge of the lane. No one spoke. They brought torches without agreeing, too. They came barefoot as if afraid to stain shoes with what was to come. For years they had turned away, dismissed the signs, accepted the disappearances as fate or punishment or mystery too sacred to touch. But something had broken. Perhaps it was the child's eyes, perhaps it was the orchard beginning to bloom out of season. Whatever it was, the silence cracked. They moved as one, not a mob, but something colder, a procession, funereal, grim. When they reached the house, it did not greet them. The windows still glowed, the walls still breathed. But the door, usually half open, stood shut, sealed, waiting. The first torch hit the shutters with a dry clatter. Another followed, then oil, then fire. Flames caught fast, too fast, as if the house had been soaked from within, as if it had always been ready to burn. But the fire did not consume. It revealed. As the roof caught and the beams howled, the windows illuminated horrors that could no longer hide in shadow. Faces, hundreds of them, pressed against the glass, mouths open in silent screams. Not alive, not quite dead. Eyes that should have turned to ash still watched, still followed. Some were fused to the walls, arms sunken into plaster, ribs embedded into floorboards. Others dangled from the rafters, stitched to the ceiling by their tongues, which flapped and curled as the heat rose. The breath of the house turned into smoke, thick and bitter, and it did not flee upward. It coiled downward into the crowd, into lungs that would never forget what they were forced to inhale. One window burst, and with it came the sound, not of flame, not of collapse, but of a bellows, a deep inhalation that made the fire pause. For a moment the flames drew inward, sucked into the house like breath before bursting out again in a roar. A lantern swung behind the broken pane. It moved not with wind or weight, but with intent, swaying side to side, then forward, as if leading something unseen through the smoke. Some swore they saw a hand beneath it, thin and long, not burned but glowing, as though fire obeyed its touch. And then they saw him. He did not run, he did not scream. Mallory stood in the center of the collapsing house, arms raised, coat unburned. The flames parted around him like reverence. His face was calm, almost joyful. Some said he held a conductor's baton. Others said his fingers made the motion themselves. He moved as though orchestrating a performance. Each beam that fell timed like a cymbal crash, each scream behind the walls a note in his final composition. The house burned not like a building, but like a body, arteries of flame, a heart of ash. Mallory stood at the center until the smoke swallowed him whole. When the last wall fell, there was no body. They dug through the ash for days, found remnants, scorched metal tools shaped like mouths and ribs, bones bent into impossible angles, organs sealed in glass that had melted but not shattered. But of Mallory nothing, not even teeth. The villagers said he had walked into the fire like it was water, and the fire had accepted him. They never found the lungs embedded in the walls. They never found the girl called the keeper. But the house did not die. Its foundation hissed when rain came, like breath held beneath the soil. The orchard remained warm long after winter returned. No grass grew where the house had stood. The earth refused. And beneath that barren patch there were sounds, soft shifts, sighs, the occasional tap of bone against stone. Some said the pipes remained buried like veins waiting for air, waiting for lungs. The villagers salted the ground. They brought in priests from other regions, spoke Latin over the ruin. But the air did not cool. Dogs would not cross the lane. Children cried without knowing why when they passed. The orchard bore no more fruit, but its roots grew wider, creeping toward the chapel, cracking stone beneath stained glass. Something still lived beneath, something that had not been cleansed. In the years that followed, the village changed. The church was boarded. The market moved uphill. The road leading to the house was buried in gravel and never walked again. But some nights, if the wind struck just right, the fire could be heard again. Not as flame, but as breath, drawn deep and slow from a house no longer standing. And if one listened long enough, it almost sounded like a choir. They brought the salt in wagons, sacks torn open by calloused hands, poured until the air turned bitter and the ground foamed white. Every stone of the ruin was buried beneath it, every root of the orchard soaked until even the worms fled. The work took days. No prayers were spoken, no songs were sung. The villagers moved in silence, eyes downcast, lips pressed thin. Some wept as they worked, not for Mallory or his victims, but for what they had allowed. They salted the bones when they found them, salted the cracks between bricks, the scorched outlines of windows, the foundation itself. When the rain came, the runoff burned the grass around it. It smoked like acid. They said salt bound evil, that it forced the spirit to remain still, unable to rise or scatter. Mallory's house was gone, but no one dared believe he was. The ground still pulsed faintly beneath the boots of those who passed too near. Salt was all they had. Salt and the memory of screams they had never heard but could no longer deny. They emptied whole barns of it, brought it from towns 3 days away. The cost was high, but the alternative was worse. One man said they should bless the field. Another said blessings had never worked there. In the end, salt was chosen because it did not ask questions. They salted the orchard until the trees collapsed inward, their trunks splitting with sickening cracks. The leaves withered overnight, the fruit fell with dull thuds, rotting faster than it should. Some of the apples bled when they hit the ground, splitting open to reveal seeds that pulsed like tiny hearts. These were buried under stones, salted again. Mallory's journals, the ones they could not burn, were sealed in barrels filled with brine and buried upside down. No one would read them. No one would remember the rituals. But the fear remained, fear that silence itself had become a language, and the village had learned to speak it too fluently. When the work was done, they stood at the edge of the field and watched the whiteness spread. The salt clung to everything, boots, skin, hair. It bit into cuts and made the eyes sting. No one celebrated. No one marked the place with a cross or a stone. They simply turned and left. From that day forward, the road to the house was unspoken. Maps were redrawn. Children were forbidden to walk near it. A generation passed, then another. And still the field remained. Nothing grew there, No grass, no weed, not even moss on the stones that remained. Birds flew wide around it. Animals would not cross it. Rain puddled and refused to sink. The villagers stopped looking at it entirely. They built homes farther away, rerouted fences. The school was moved to the northern hill. The chapel's doors were nailed shut. And yet, the field stayed, white, cracked, gleaming under moonlight like a wound too old to bleed but too deep to heal. Children asked why the earth there looked wrong, why it tasted like metal when the wind blew across it. Parents only shook their heads. Some said it was a plague site, others said nothing. Those who had poured the salt were old now, their hands twisted with time. They remembered, but they had forgotten how to speak of it. Language shriveled around that memory like the orchard roots had under brine. Occasionally someone would pass through the village, a scholar, a traveler, a priest, and ask about the barren patch of land. The villagers always said the same thing. It was cursed. The traveler might ask why. They never asked twice. Those who lingered too near the edge at dusk swore they heard breathing beneath their feet. Faint, slow, impossible. A few claimed to see lantern light just below the surface, moving like something buried but restless. The villagers said it was imagination. Then they changed the subject. Salt should have ended it. That's what they believed. But the scar did not fade. The village lived beside it the way a man lives with an old injury, something that twinges in cold weather, something that alters how he walks. Children who grew up there dreamed of lungs stitched into walls. They drew pictures of houses that breathed, of faces in glass. They could not explain why. No one had told them. And yet the shapes came through. The silence grew thicker. Generations passed without a single mention of the name Mallory. It was not forbidden. It was gone, erased so thoroughly that even those who should have known it began to doubt he had ever existed. But the land remembered. The salt kept him down, perhaps, but it did not unmake him. Evil had not been cleansed. It had only been bound. On the centennial of the fire, the ground cracked, just once. A narrow fracture across the center of the salted ruin, as thin as a knife wound. No sound accompanied it, no movement. But the air shifted. It grew warmer for a moment, then cold again. The villagers said nothing. A few moved away. One woman poured another layer of salt across the crack, tears running silently as she worked. There would be no memorial, no marker, no shrine, only salt and silence. That was all they had left. Decades after the orchard rotted and the chapel fell, a researcher named Théo Vallon discovered a sealed chest buried beneath the archives of Rouen. It was meant to be burned, but someone, perhaps a clerk with a conscience, had instead locked it away in the rafters of a forgotten room. When opened, it released not dust but dread. Inside were letters signed in noble hands, journals written in an elegant medical script, and anatomical sketches so precise they could not have come from textbooks. The pages were thin and yellowed, but their contents were thick with cruelty. The ink had not faded. The words had not dulled. The silence that had swallowed Mallory for nearly a century cracked open. Theo read of the hymn of humility, of skeletal cages built from patient to patient. He read about the orchard, the burning font, the house that had learned to breathe. He read descriptions of experiments on children, how their pain was measured in breath intervals, how their silence was mistaken for consent. The papers were not confessions. They were proud documentation. Mallory had believed what he did was necessary, beautiful. Some pages were annotated in royal ink. One bore a wax seal from a cardinal, another carried a pressed violet dry but intact. It was too much for one man to carry. Theo copied what he could and brought the evidence to the University of Paris, where a commission was quietly formed. Laws were reviewed. Historical timelines were redrawn. Panels of medical historians debated whether Mallory had ever truly existed. Some said it was myth, a horror story buried in fact. Others knew better. His name may have faded, but his fingerprints remained on every rule governing anatomical practice, every restriction on human experimentation, every debate about informed consent. They had not stopped him out of morality. They had simply found better ways to hide what he revealed. In the following years, new guidelines were drafted for confinement and treatment. Patients could no longer be held without documentation. Procedures had to be witnessed. Medical spaces were required to disclose methods, store records, and seek permission. But the language used in these laws was always distant, clinical, safe. It avoided what had prompted them. It did not mention the house. It did not mention the choir made of tongues. It did not mention the fruit that grew from ash. Mallory's name was never cited. To name him would be to make him real again. One scholar, desperate to understand the extent of the erasure, visited the village where the house once stood. He expected a plaque, a grave, a scar. What he found was worse. Nothing. A white field, dead and dry, flat as bone. Locals wouldn't speak of it. They offered vague stories about a fire, a salt mishap, a failed orchard. No record survived. The church had been torn down, the chapel bell buried. The school children were never told. And yet when he stood on the edge of that field, he swore he could hear something beneath the soil, faint and low, like breath drawn through wet stone. He returned to the city without a single note. His papers remain unpublished. There are places even now where hospitals hum too quietly, where wards for the terminal seem to press inward with invisible weight, where doctors speak of resilience like it's a measure of worth, where suffering is documented but not eased, where the breath of patients becomes data instead of pain. Mallory's house is gone, but his method is not. His logic still haunts the corners of progress. The belief that silence can be sanctified, that pain reveals purity, that some lives can be reshaped for the sake of a higher understanding. He taught them how to hide it, not with secrecy but with ceremony. His victims were never buried. They became part of the orchard, the walls, the systems he built. Their names were not recorded, but their bodies changed the laws. Their silence became the backbone of every policy meant to prevent another Mallory. Yet no monument bears their image. No mass was ever held. And so the silence he cultivated has outlived him. It did not die in fire, it spread. Mallory did not die in the house. They know that now. Too many letters mention his departure. Too many accounts end with his absence, not his death. Some believe he fled to the coast, disguised as a physician for sailors. Others say he died in a monastery, hidden by monks who mistook his calm for sanctity. A few believe he still lives, in idea, if not in flesh, whispered in the margins of medical schools, echoed in labs where ethics bend. His story persists not through memory but through caution, through policies designed to keep suffering at a distance, through systems that swear they would never allow what he did, yet still ask what can be learned from pain. There are students who study anatomy and ask why certain terms are banned. There are doctors who hear faint sighs in old operating theaters and cannot explain why they feel watched. Mallory did not build a legacy. He built a silence that echoes, a silence that instructs, a silence that protects the line between curiosity and cruelty. It is a thin line. He knew that. He spent his life dancing across it with surgical precision. Now the laws stand like walls around what must never happen again, but walls breathe if built the wrong way. And silence listens. It waits for doors left open, for names erased, for rules softened by time. Mallory hid behind innocence, behind science, behind monarchy itself. His victims became fruit, breath, walls, silence. His legacy shaped laws and fears, but not memory. It lives not in storybooks, but in the absences between rules. In the gaps of language, in the fields salted white so that no one asks what once grew there. What do you think? Could a house like his stand again, behind smiling faces and the promise of progress?